bitter spring of 1348, the shadow of the Black Death stretched across the breadth of southern Europe. Bitter spring of 1348, the shadow of the Black Death stretched across the breadth of southern Europe, infecting major port cities like Genoa, Naples, and Marseille, and a host of others. Even the wisest physicians of the time, trained in the ancient healing arts of the Greeks, were mystified at how to combat the pestilence. How did the victims become infected? Did the disease travel by air? Could it be spread by food or human touch? All they knew was that his symptoms were horrible beyond imagining.
That's an ink drawing of them lancing a bubo. A bubo is a swollen lymph node. That's where it gets the term bubonic plague. And I don't know if that's a source of a boo-boo that your parents, your grandparents, if you felt and kind of got a little bump. But when they were talking about that quarantine, when the ships had come back from Kaffa, where it was a problem, they would for 40 days would let people off of the ship. And that's where we get the term quarantine from, because it was 40 days. So we have a lot of terms and practices that date back to this. So the buboes are where your lymph nodes are, and you're supposed to know where those are from your A and P, but your lymph vessels are all over your body, in your groin and under your arms and other places.
First, they felt a tingling sensation, as if they were being pricked by the points of arrows. The next stage was a fearsome attack, which took the form of an extremely hard boil. As it grew more solid, its burning heat caused the patients to fall into an acute and putrid fever. Gabriele de Mussis, Piacenza, Italy.
You see death depicted behind the doors and all around, so there's death right there.
To people of the time, one characteristic of this mystifying affliction was especially repugnant. For as the skin cells of the victim died, his body turned black. And even though the one stricken with this black death was still alive, he was condemned to smell the stench of his own decomposing flesh.
The way the cell necrosis turned the body black and then made it stink, even while one was still alive, must have been horrifying to friends and relatives who were trying to nurse the plague victim.
Some patients died within hours, but most suffered the disease for 5 agonizing days. With the apocalypse seemingly at hand, for those who still clung to life, the most terrifying question was, why? The most learned philosophers of the time looked for answers in the stars and concluded that the pestilence was not of this world.
Remember the Dark Ages right here now. We're just barely come out of the Dark Ages. It went from 200 to 1200 AD. This is 1347 or 8. And so, man, we just barely passed scratch here. So listen carefully what they thought caused it.
One theory was that God caused the planets to line up in such a way that a plague was produced. Another theory was that comets brought on the plague. So in effect, God would be acting through some kind of other object that would bring on the plague.
Others were convinced that the Black Death arose from the depths of the earth, blaming the plague on earthquakes they believed unleashed deadly gases into the atmosphere. no explanation was too far-fetched for a pestilence which defied comprehension.
Is that a Van Gogh painting? Anybody taking art appreciation? I think that's a Van Gogh painting.
People probably felt that it was going to reach their area, almost regardless of what they did. They were desperate. They had no way to prevent it. And it's coming. And it's coming closer. And they didn't know what to do.
For reasons which remain a mystery to this day, all places in Europe did not suffer equally from the Black Death's onslaught. While Florence and Venice were emptied of nearly half their populations, only a handful of victims perished in the city of Milan. And a few fortunate communities suffered no fatalities at all. Even more mysteriously, the plague did not kill everyone exposed to the disease. Many people living side by side with plague victims would emerge unscathed. Why were they spared? In an attempt to make sense of this random horror, medieval thinkers likened living with the plague to facing an army of archers. Some would be hit by the arrows, while others would emerge unharmed. If the plague resembled an attack of arrows, the desperate logic went, then why not pray to a holy man who had endured such an onslaught? So it was that Saint Sebastian, who...
I saw this painting of Saint Sebastian in Artberg, Germany, but I'm sure a lot of different artists painted this scene. So that's Saint Sebastian.
According to legend, had been pierced by arrows and survived, would become the patron saint of those who suffered from the Black Death. As the plague worsened and prayers to Saint Sebastian went unanswered, people turned to a saint who had suffered from the Black Death himself. Saint Roch, a Frenchman, had contracted the disease while nursing plague sufferers, yet had miraculously survived.
I need to basically give you the background because it'll be a good while before we actually cover this. The Black Death is caused by bacteria, and where it originated, the bacteria picked up by fleas. Fleas would get on mammals, like rats, and when the rat would die, the fleas would hop off and then bite something else and would bite humans. So if you weren't bitten by a flea that was carrying it, you didn't get it. And when it got in your bloodstream, that's what caused the swelling of the lymph nodes or the buboes. And when it was in your bloodstream, it was 50% fatal. But if the bacteria was able to get in your lungs, it was called pneumonic plague, and they don't use that term. But when it got there, it was 100% fatal. And they're going to address Child's Rhyme a little bit later. But so that's how it's transmitted.
Would he answer their prayers? By the fall of 1348, it must have seemed to even the most devout that God had forsaken them. The Black Death had cut a broad swath across Europe, spreading from southern England in the west to Germany in the east. For many, even more terrifying than the fear of death was the prospect of what lay beyond the grave. If there was anything these people feared more than death, it was the possibility their souls would be damned for eternity.
If one dies without having last rites, that means that you have died with your soul in a state where it has not been forgiven all of its sins. Hence, you could expect more time in purgatory, or if you had been a particularly wicked sinner, you might wind up directly in hell.
if to defy the will of God, the Black Death took so many lives so quickly that there was no chance to give all the victims the last rites of the church. In response to the urgent need of thousands for a Christian burial, Pope Clement VI granted remission of sin to all who died of the plague. The living, however, found this scant reassurance. As 1348 drew to a close, with God seemingly having forsaken them, many resorted to their own ingenious attempts at cures. When we return, why even the wisest people thought bizarre rituals and even murder would protect them from the Black Death. Ancient Mysteries will return in a moment.
David's training for the wrestling team.
Hi. Valley Ranch. Trees drawn on maps.
This is your last chance to see the best movie.
Trees drawn.
You were going the right shoe.
STS with a 300 horsepower North Star system. More horsepower than any car in its class. STS.
To death late last night outside his apartment building.
The death toll soared as the mysterious plague continued its relentless advance across Europe. Paris succumbed to the plague in the summer of 1349. In that stricken city alone, 800 people perished each day. The medical knowledge of the time was overwhelmed by the mystifying epidemic. One of the most common treatments was bloodletting, which ironically may have led to further spread of the disease. Priests and doctors who tended to the sick often became infected by their patients, many times following them to the grave.
One can probably say about physicians, as one can say about churchmen and churchwomen, that some were genuinely heroic. They continued to treat their patients, to give care to the sick, and many of those died.
Driven by hope and sheer desperation, the people themselves attempted to improvise their own ingenious strategies for survival. Could they unlock the plague's secrets before it was too late? Hoping that total isolation could shield them from the pestilence, the citizens of London walled themselves into their city to lock the Black Death out. Their efforts were tragically misguided, and half of the city's population of 50,000 died. To stop the vessels which they believed carried the plague, the people of Venice enacted a law ordering all incoming ships to be isolated for 40 days, or 40 giorni, from which the word quarantine derives. But the law was enacted too late to save the doomed people of Venice. By mid-1349, half of its citizens perished. Perhaps the greatest mystery of the Black Death was how the plague reached its victims. Some were convinced that the stench of the sickness means by which they developed a startling defense.
They would attempt to reduce odors or vapors, or in many cases, they would also use perfumes, because if the air around them smelled good, they believed that it would prevent those foul odors from giving them disease.
Dressed like beings from another world, physicians wore bizarre protective clothing to limit their exposure to the noxious odors of the dead and dying.
They tended to wear long gowns and long gauntlets or gloves that would cover their hands, protect their bodies from any emanations coming from the sick person. They would also then wear a mask that would almost look like a bird face. And that long nose or that long beak can be filled with various herbs, things that could purify corrupt air.
Some believed the Black Death to be so virulent that to even look upon one stricken with the disease could cause instant infection. So the bird-like masks worn by physicians often included protective red crystal eyepieces to shield them from this imagined threat. Despite their best efforts, none of the physicians' remedies proved effective. The more their patients died, the more bizarre their treatments became. When lancing the telltale buboes or lumps of a plague patient did not effect a cure, physicians turned to unlikely allies for help.
It was suggested, for example, that pigeons be used to suck the blood from the buboes. Another recipe involved taking hot onions and applying them to the sores.
People tried everything to ward off the plague. They would carry posies of flowers and sniff them to try to keep away the bad air. They would keep their windows closed. They avoided taking naps during the day. They changed their diet. They gave up washing.
According to the brutal logic of the time, the sick were often objects of fear and loathing instead of objects of pity. And in their panic to escape the disease, some would go to any lengths, even murder. When a case of the Black Death was reported in the city of Milan, authorities ordered that all those at the home of the afflicted, living and dead, were to be walled inside and left to die. Was it because of this ruthless approach?
Now, earlier they said it was kind of a mystery why so few died in Milan. But you found there the reason for it. If one family member had it, they literally bricked up all the windows and doors and left the entire family to die. So that did cut down the death rate of Milan. Rather drastic, but it worked.
That in Milan the plague did not spread as it had in other cities? Of all the stories of those who did survive, perhaps none would be more extraordinary than the story of Pope Clement VI.
This shouldn't be a mystery either. Like, well, he didn't get it, but he isolated himself away from everybody, and the rest of it would make it obvious.
Following the advice of his physician, he spent a hot summer barricaded, sweltering in his chambers with bonfires of burning herbs and aromatic woods, as outside the plague ravaged his city. To this day, the reason for the Pope's seemingly miraculous survival remains a medical mystery.
Duh. Yeah, he isolated himself. And, yeah.
As the Black Death continued to ravage Europe, it did more than afflict the bodies of its victims.
Okay, notice the baby. You see the buboes? Massive buboes on that baby.
As devastating as the physical effects of the disease was its evil psychological impact, which would see the rise of the flagellants, a movement of violent religious fanatics. When we return, can the flagellants stave off the Black Death by subjecting themselves to excruciating torture? Ancient Mysteries will return in a moment here on A&E. Torture of its victims by their... As the fateful year of 1349 drew to a close and the Black Death continued its reign of terror across Europe, all those who had survived were forever marked by their harrowing ordeal. For just as the disease rotted the bodies of its victims, so it scarred the psyches of those who had endured. The Black Death tore apart the fabric of trust which had held communities together and cruelly shattered the bond of faith between loved ones.
And when the sick were in the throes of death, they still called out piteously to their family and neighbors. "Come here, I'm thirsty. Bring me a drink of water. Don't be frightened. Perhaps I won't die. Please, hold me tight. Hug my wasted body. You ought to be holding me in your arms." Gabriele De Mussis, Piacenza, Italy.
Would you have? People died during the Spanish flu that were taking care of patients? Yes. Did people die that were taking care of plague victims? Yes. Have people died taking care of COVID patients? Yeah. So healthcare is a noble thing. So when they're referred to as first responders and heroes, yeah. So I respect you guys going into that field. And you need to think, if something comes up that they don't know how it's transmitted, there's no vaccine for it, no effective treatment for it, you don't know how it's transmitted, do you go to work or do you call in sick? Yeah. And I had students a few years ago, or a student that worked at a hospital in Fort Worth where that Ebola patient was. And a nurse got it, but luckily she survived. So, yeah, there's a lot of stuff out there, folks.
I imagine that the carnage, the unburied bodies, the stench, the horror, the not knowing why plague was spreading must have created a deeply traumatized population that in some ways became totally disenfranchised